The whole town mocked her. They called her invisible, a ragged seamstress living in a dilapidated house with nothing but calloused hands and a silent pride. But when the most powerful man in the valley, the one every wealthy widow desired, walked in and chose her, Black Ash Crossing erupted in rage. Little did they know that the woman they despised most would be the only one who could save them all. Please comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because the best part is yet to come. The morning Gideon Voss rode into town to announce his engagement, Elena Mercer was on her knees in the dirt outside her cabin, trying to fix a broken hinge on her door with a bent nail and a rock. She had been at it for 20 minutes. The hinge kept slipping. The wood around the frame had rotted soft in 2 places. And every time she thought she had the nail seated right, the whole thing shifted and she had to start over. Her fingers were cold. It was early October, and the mornings in Black Ash Crossing had started carrying that particular bite that warned you winter wasn't being polite about its arrival this year. And her knuckles were scraped from where the rock had glanced off wrong on the 3rd try. She didn't hear the commotion building in the center of town at first. The wind came from the wrong direction, and she was focused on the hinge. It wasn't until old Pete Dalloway's dog started barking from 2 lots over, and then kept barking, that she looked up and noticed the cluster of people forming down near the feed store. She could make out raised voices, though not words. She could see the shape of a horse she recognized, that big dark gray gelding that belonged to the Voss Ranch, unmistakable even at distance because of how it stood, like it had decided to be taller than other horses and had mostly succeeded. Elena sat back on her heels and wiped her hands on her work apron. She would find out what the fuss was about eventually. Black Ash Crossing was not a town that kept its business quiet for long. She went back to the hinge. She found out about it an hour later when Marta Hesse came by to pick up the vest Elena had been altering for her husband. Marta was one of the few women in town who still came to Elena without requiring some kind of nudge or necessity. Not because they were close friends, they weren't exactly, but because Marta had decided early on that Elena did good work at a fair price and that the opinions of other women about where you had your mending done was the kind of thing a sensible person didn't concern herself with. Marta was, Elena had always privately felt, admirably sensible. She was not sensible today. She was barely through the door of Elena's cabin before she started talking. "You heard yet?" "Heard what?" "About Gideon Voss." Elena turned from the small work table where she'd been trimming threads from the vest, checking the seams one more time out of habit. "No. What about him?" Marta set down the small bundle she was carrying, potatoes from her garden, which she sometimes brought as payment when her coin was short, and looked at Elena with an expression that was a complicated mixture of excitement and genuine uncertainty about how to say what she had to say. "He announced this morning that he's getting married." Elena raised her eyebrows slightly. This was not, on its face, a remarkable piece of news. Men on the frontier got married. It happened regularly. "All right. To you." The thread scissors in Elena's hand stopped moving. She looked at Marta. Marta looked back at her with that same complicated expression and nodded slowly, as if confirming something Elena had misheard. "He said your name," Marta said, "in front of Harlan Dutcher and Carol Pemberton, and probably 15 other people. Said he intends to marry Elena Mercer, the seamstress." Marta paused. "He described you as the seamstress on the edge of town, in case there was any confusion about which Elena Mercer he meant, I suppose." Elena set the scissors down carefully on the work table. "That can't be right," she said. "That's what everybody else said, too." Marta picked up the potatoes again, then seemed to decide she didn't know what to do with them and set them back down. "Elena, I am telling you what I heard with my own 2 ears, standing not 15 feet away. The man said your name." Elena had lived in Black Ash Crossing for 4 years. She had arrived with a broken wagon, a sewing kit, and a dead husband. Not that anyone here had known Daniel Mercer, who had died of a fever on the road 2 days before they were supposed to reach the town they'd originally been heading to. She'd buried him in the ground beside a creek she couldn't name, said what words she could think of, and then gotten back on the wagon and kept moving because there was nothing else to do. She'd stopped at Black Ash Crossing because her horse had gone lame, and she'd needed a farrier, and by the time the horse was right again, she'd already taken in 3 pieces of mending and used the money to buy herself a week's food. It had seemed like as reasonable a sign as any that this was where she was going to be for a while. The cabin on the east edge of town had been available because nobody else wanted it. It was small and cold, and the roof had leaked in 2 places until she'd climbed up and patched it herself with wood scraps and tar she'd bought from the hardware man. She'd fixed the fireplace drawing with a trick Daniel had taught her. She'd built her work table from lumber salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding nobody was using. In 4 years, she had become a fixture of the town the way a particular fence post becomes a fixture, noticeable mainly when it wasn't there, not especially considered otherwise. She repaired what people brought her. She charged fair prices. She kept to herself. On the rare occasions when someone tried to have a real conversation with her at the general store or along the street, she was pleasant enough, but she didn't seek it out. She had learned in the first year that a woman alone in a small town occupied a particular kind of social position that was easier to navigate if you stayed close to its edges. She was not friends with Gideon Voss. She was not anything with Gideon Voss. She had repaired a pair of leather gloves for one of his ranch hands once, and the hand had paid her and left, and she wasn't sure if Gideon Voss even knew her name. Apparently, he did. The reaction in town was immediate and not subtle. By the time Elena walked down to the general store late that same afternoon, she needed lamp oil, and she needed it before dark, so there was no real choice about timing. She could feel the difference in how people looked at her, or rather, looked at her and then looked at each other. Carol Pemberton was standing on the porch of the store with 2 other women whose names Elena knew but wouldn't have called acquaintances. When she climbed the steps, Carol didn't move out of the way. "Well," Carol said. Elena stopped. She looked at Carol, then at the other 2 women, then back at Carol. "Good afternoon," she said. "I suppose you think this is very clever," Carol said. Elena was genuinely confused for a moment. Then she understood. "I didn't know anything about it," she said, "until this morning." "I'm sure you didn't." Carol's tone made it very clear she was sure of the opposite. "Carol?" "Gideon Voss," Carol said, her voice dropping just slightly, which somehow made it worse, "has been approached by women of standing in this valley for 3 years, women with land and money and something to offer, and now he's decided he wants—" She looked at Elena with a brief, deliberate assessment, the kind that was meant to be seen. "This." One of the other women made a small sound that might have been a laugh suppressed too late. Elena breathed in slowly. She thought about the lamp oil. She thought about walking around them, going inside, getting what she came for, and leaving. She thought about the bent nail and the broken hinge and the fact that she'd fixed it, in the end, with a different approach than the one she'd started with. "I'd like to get past, please," she said. Carol moved, but slowly, and in a way that made it clear she was choosing to move, not being asked. She didn't go looking for Gideon Voss. She thought about it and then decided against it, on the grounds that she didn't know what she would say, and showing up at a man's ranch to ask him what he'd been thinking seemed likely to produce a worse situation than the one she was already in. He came to her. 4 days after the announcement, 4 days during which Elena had taken in half her usual amount of work, because 3 regular customers had stopped bringing things, and 1 woman had actually crossed the street when she saw Elena coming. She was in her cabin in the early evening, working by lamplight on a pair of trousers that needed the seat restitched, when she heard a knock at her door. She almost didn't open it. She'd been dealing with enough unpleasant visitors that her first instinct had become caution. But the knock was measured and didn't repeat itself urgently, which didn't match the pattern of people who came to tell her what they thought of her, and she had enough stubbornness left in her to be curious. Gideon Voss was standing on her step. He was taller than she'd registered the few times she'd seen him from a distance. Not exceptionally tall, but he took up space in a way that came from somewhere other than size, the set of his shoulders maybe, or the way he stood without leaning, without shifting his weight from foot to foot the way people did when they weren't sure of themselves. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been outdoors for a long time. He was holding his hat in his hands. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mrs.," she said before she'd decided to. "It's Mrs. Mercer." Something moved briefly in his expression. "I apologize, Mrs. Mercer." "You'd better come in," she said, "though the place is what it is." He came in. He stood near the door, looking around at the cabin. The work table, with its careful arrangement of tools, the stacked spools of thread organized by color and thickness, the patches of wall she'd reinforced where the wood had gone soft, the shelves she'd built herself from lumber she'd planed smooth, and she couldn't read what he thought of any of it. "I imagine," he said, "you have questions." "I imagine most of the county has questions," she said. She sat back down at the table but didn't pick up the trousers. "I'll start with the obvious one. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He didn't sit. She hadn't offered him a seat, which she registered only after a moment as a mild rudeness, but he didn't seem to take it as one. "I've watched you," he said finally. "Not in any... I don't mean that to sound wrong. I mean that in a small town, you see people, how they handle things, and I've been watching how you handle things for about 2 years." "You've known my name for 2 years," she said. "I've known your name since about 6 months after you arrived," he said. "My hand brought back those gloves you repaired. I noticed the work. I asked who did it." Elena looked at him. She thought about the gloves. She'd spent extra time on them because the leather had been good quality and she'd wanted to do it justice. "The work is how I keep track of people," she said. It wasn't exactly a question, but it wasn't not one either. "I understand that," he said. "It's not a bad method." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the edge of her lot, a sound she'd come to find useful. It told her about weather, about direction, about time of night. "What exactly are you offering?" she said. He set his hat on the corner of her work table, carefully, not knocking anything. "Partnership," he said. "Not..." He paused. "I'm not looking for something romantic. I don't know if that's something I'm capable of anymore. My wife died 6 years ago. We had 11 years together, and I think I used up most of what I had in that department." He said this matter-of-factly, not with self-pity, which she found she respected more than she expected to. "What I need is someone who can help me run that ranch, who's practical, who's competent, who won't come apart under pressure, and I think you're those things." "You think?" she said. "I think," he agreed. "I could be wrong. I don't think I am." She looked at the trousers on her table. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the wall where she'd written measurements in pencil because she'd run out of paper. "I need a day," she said. "That's fair," he said. He picked up his hat and left. She lay awake most of that night thinking about it. She was 31 years old. She had $62 saved in a tin box under a loose board beneath her work table. Money she'd put away coin by coin for 4 years, which was not nothing, but was also very little when she thought about what it would actually need to carry her through if her body stopped being able to do the work it was doing now. She had no family within reachable distance. She had her skills and her tools and her reputation, such as it was, and that reputation had just taken a hit that she wasn't entirely sure she could recover from in this particular town. She also thought about Carol Pemberton's face, about the sound one of the women had made, about crossing the street. She thought about Daniel, who she had loved genuinely and lost so suddenly that even 4 years later the fact of his absence still sometimes caught her off guard in idle moments, like finding an empty pocket where you expected to find something. She thought about the word Gideon Voss had used, partnership. She had built a life out of partnerships, between her hands and her tools, between the material and the pattern, between what was damaged and what she could repair it into. She understood the value of a good join. In the morning, she sent him a note with the Hesse boy, who ran messages for a small coin. The note said, "I have conditions. Come back tonight, and I'll tell you what they are." He came back. They talked for 2 hours. She laid out her conditions clearly and without apology. She would keep her workshop. She would have her own money, separate from the ranch accounts, earned from her own work. She would not be decoration or company or a presence at parties. She would do what she was actually good at, applied to whatever needed it on the ranch, and he would not second-guess her methods. She would not be obligated to pretend that the town's opinion of her mattered when it conflicted with what she could see was true. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "I have one condition of my own. Tell me." Honesty, he said. I don't care if you tell me something I don't want to hear. I'd rather have that than someone who tells me what's comfortable. He paused. My foreman is very good at telling me what's comfortable. I'm already aware of the problem. Elena almost smiled. I think I can manage that. Then we have an agreement. The wedding was at the county clerk's office, not a church, which the town found additionally offensive. It took 11 minutes. The clerk, a tired man named Aldous Burke, who had seen a great many things in his time as clerk and had ceased finding most of them remarkable, recorded the names and the date and wished them well with the particular flatness of a man fulfilling a requirement. 2 of Gideon's ranch hands stood as witnesses because there was no one else. Marta Hesse brought a small bread loaf to Elena the evening after. She stood on the step of what was now going to be Elena's former cabin. Elena planned to use it as her workshop since Gideon had no objection, and held out the bread with the expression of someone doing a thing they've decided is right regardless of how it goes. I wanted to say congratulations, Marta said, even if everybody else is saying something else. What's everybody else saying? Elena said. Oh, you know. Marta made a small gesture. The usual variety of things people say when something doesn't match what they expected. That I tricked him. That's the popular theory, yes. Elena took the bread. It was still warm. Do you think that? Marta considered it honestly, which Elena appreciated. No, she said finally. I think Gideon Voss is the kind of man who does exactly what he intends to do. But I also think... She paused. I think this is going to be harder than you know yet. Elena looked down at the bread in her hands. Probably, she agreed. Moving into the Voss ranch house was one of the stranger experiences of Elena's recent life, and she had had several strange experiences to compare it to. The house itself was not what she'd expected. It was large, larger than she'd pictured, 2 full stories with a covered porch running the front and side, situated on a rise above the main valley floor so that on clear mornings you could see the mountains that rimmed the eastern horizon. But it was also obviously a house where practicality had won every argument with comfort for at least the last 6 years. The furniture was solid but worn. The curtains in the main room were sun-faded, and one of them had a tear along the hem that had been ignored so long the tear had gone further. The kitchen had good equipment that hadn't been organized with any thought toward how someone actually cooked. The upstairs hallway had a loose board third from the top of the stairs that had been loose so long the wood around it had given up on it. She noticed all of this in the first hour. She didn't say anything about most of it. Not yet. What she did say, when she found the state of the supply room, a small room off the kitchen that held the household stores, which were in an organizational state that she could only describe as someone had decided that organization was a philosophical stance they disagreed with, was, I'm going to need to understand the supply system. Gideon was showing her the house himself rather than delegating it, which she'd noted. He stopped in the doorway of the supply room. There isn't much of a system, he said. I can see that. She looked at the shelves, at the jumbled tins and sacks and loose items, at the shelf bracket that had given partially away from the wall and been propped up with a cut piece of wood that had then been forgotten there. Is there a written record of what comes in and what gets used? He was quiet for a moment. There was, he said. My wife kept it. She didn't press the rest of that sentence. I'll start a new one, she said, if that's all right. That's fine, he said. The tone they settled into in those first days was professional, which was what it was supposed to be, but which still required some adjustment from both of them. They ate meals at the same table and talked about the ranch, about what was coming for winter, about the state of the fencing in the north pasture, about the 2 horses that needed their shoes reset. They didn't talk about much else. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was more like 2 people who'd agreed to work on the same project, but were still figuring out how to be in the same room while they did it. The ranch hands were a different matter. There were 11 of them, ranging from old Cal Brigham, who had been at the Voss Ranch longer than most people could clearly remember, and whose opinion of everything was delivered in a particular tone that indicated he had already decided and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up, to a young man named Tommy Reeves, who had been hired 3 months ago and still had the slightly alert quality of someone who doesn't yet know all the rules. They were civil to her. That was the word she kept coming back to. Civil. Polite in the way that people are polite when they've been told to be polite and are being polite. Not rude, but waiting, she could feel, for her to show them something or fail to show them something, and they had theories about which it would be. The thing that cracked it open, the first real thing, was not what she would have predicted. It was a saddle. On the third day, she was in the barn. She'd gone to look at the state of the tack, which she'd learned was a significant expense on any working ranch, and one that she thought she might be able to help with, when she found two hands arguing quietly over a saddle that had split along the tree. The two men, she had their names placed by now, Frank O'Dara and a quieter man called Stern, stopped arguing when she came in. They looked at her. She looked at the saddle. "How long has that been split?" she said. "Couple weeks," Frank said, his tone landing somewhere between polite and guarded. She went over and looked at it more closely. The split was along the left side of the pommel, where the leather had dried and contracted. She could see how it had started, a stress point that had been ignored past the point where ignoring it was still an option. "If it goes any further, it'll take the candle with it," she said. "The whole seat could go." "That's what I was telling him," Stern said. "We need a new one." "You don't need a new one," Elena said. "Not yet. A good repair could get you another 2 seasons out of this." She straightened up. "Bring it to me this evening. I'll need my awl and the right weight thread. I have both. And you'll need to get me some neat's foot oil. The leather's too dry." Frank looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You can work leather?" "I can work most things," she said. "That's why I'm here." She walked out of the barn. Behind her, she heard Stern say something to Frank in a low voice, and she didn't catch the words, but she heard the tone, and the tone had shifted slightly from where it had been before. The saddle repair took her 3 evenings of work. When she was done, it was not pretty. The stitching was visible in a way the original hadn't been, and the section she'd had to reinforce left a slight variation in the leather surface, but it was solid. She pressed on it, flexed it, checked every inch of the seam, and when she was satisfied, she brought it back to the barn and hung it on its peg. Frank O'Dara examined it the next morning. He didn't say anything to her directly, but she heard him tell Tommy Reeves later in a tone that was not quite the same as before that Mrs. Voss had put that thing back together right. She counted it. What she hadn't counted on was the cold. Not the weather cold. She had prepared for that. Had looked at the stores and the firewood situation and the state of the winter gear with the deliberate focus of someone who had spent a winter in a leaking cabin and had learned her lessons accordingly. The cold she hadn't prepared for was the kind that came from the town. Carol Pemberton had not, as Elena had distantly hoped, simply moved on to other things. Carol Pemberton had, Elena began to understand, made this into a project. She heard it from Marta first, and then in bits and pieces from places she hadn't expected. The story circulating in Black Ash Crossing was that Elena Mercer, some of them still called her, as if refusing to acknowledge the marriage was a small act of resistance, had manufactured the attachment somehow. The theories varied in their particulars. In one version, she had used some influence over Gideon to make him believe he needed her. In another, she had fabricated a debt, or an obligation. In the most elaborate version, which had apparently been circulating for almost 2 weeks by the time Elena heard it, she had been secretly sending him letters and had somehow manipulated the correspondence so that he didn't know where they were really coming from. "That last one doesn't even make sense," Elena said to Marta, who had come by the workshop to drop off a pair of trousers and had mentioned it with the careful look of someone who knows they're bringing information the other person might rather not have, but believes they deserve to. "No," Marta agreed. "It doesn't make very much sense. But it doesn't need to. It needs to sound like it could be true, when people are already looking to believe it." Elena looked at the trousers. She looked at her work table. She picked up her seam ripper. "What do they want?" she said. Not angrily, just asking. Marta thought about it. "I think they want you to leave," she said. "Or fail. One or the other would satisfy most of them, I think." Elena turned the trousers over and found the seam that needed attention. "Well," she said, "they'll be waiting a while." Checked. The first real confrontation happened in the feed store, 3 weeks after the wedding. Elena had gone in to speak with the owner about the ranch's winter grain order. It was something she'd offered to handle after looking at the supply records, and realizing the order hadn't been placed yet and the window to get good pricing was narrowing. Gideon had handed her the account book with what she was beginning to understand was his characteristic directness, which was that he identified something as her competence and then simply let her apply it. The feed store was owned and operated by a man named Douglas Crane, who was about 60, thickly built, and had the manner of someone who had formed his opinions about the proper order of things some decades ago and found them confirmed on a daily basis. He was not one of the people she would have predicted would be a problem. She walked in, introduced herself, explained what she was there about, and told him the amount and variety of grain they'd need, with the delivery timing, which she'd calculated from the stores and the livestock count and the range of winter scenarios she'd considered. Crane listened to her. Then he said, "I'll need to confirm this with Mr. Voss." She kept her expression even. "Mr. Voss sent me," she said. "I handle the household and supply accounts." "I'm sure he did," Crane said. He said it in a tone that indicated he was not at all sure Gideon had sent her, or that even if he had, the sending of her rather than coming himself was not a choice he respected. "But a purchase of this size, I'll want it from him directly." She looked at Crane. Crane looked back at her with the settled confidence of a man who has decided what he's decided and finds further discussion irrelevant. "I'll let him know," she said. She walked back to the ranch. She told Gideon what had happened without editorializing, because he'd asked for honesty, and this was what honest looked like. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Give me the order sheet," he said. He rode to town himself that same afternoon. She didn't ask what he said to Crane, but when she went to follow up on the delivery timing 2 days later, Crane addressed her by her name and by the correct name, and the grain arrived on schedule. It was not nothing. She was also not foolish enough to think it was the end of something. It was more likely the beginning, but she had been dealing with beginnings for a long time. The thing that surprised her most in those first weeks at the ranch was not the hostility she'd prepared for. It was Gideon himself, not in any dramatic way. It was the small things that accumulated. He noticed work, not just her work. He noticed it everywhere, in everyone, and he named it specifically rather than generally. He didn't say "good job" the way people did when they meant nothing by it. He said, "That stitching you did on the grain sacks, I checked it when the order came in, and those joins won't slip." Or, "The way you laid out the winter schedule, the foreman didn't have to ask a single question about it. That's not nothing." She found this unexpectedly disarming. She had not, she realized, had many people in her life who noticed work. Daniel had been a man who felt things strongly and expressed them warmly, and she had loved that about him, but specific noticing had not been his particular strength. Most of the people in town related to her work the way they related to a functioning door. They noticed it only when it stopped working. She was in her workshop one evening, the old cabin, which she had by now organized into something that actually functioned, when Gideon stopped by. This was slightly unusual. He didn't typically come to the workshop. He stood in the doorway and looked at how she'd arranged things, the sorted thread and the tools on their hooks, and the pattern paper in the flat drawer she'd built from scavenged wood. "You built that drawer yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I needed somewhere flat," she said. "Nothing was the right size." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say that half of managing a ranch is figuring out what doesn't exist yet that you need." She looked up from what she was working on. "She sounds like she was sharp," Elena said. "She was," he said simply. He didn't say it with grief exactly. It was something past grief, something that had settled into a different shape. "I think you would have had a lot to talk about." He said goodnight and left. She sat with that for a while in the lamplight. Shots. The winter came hard. Not dramatically hard, not in the way that made legends. No blizzards in October, no livestock frozen in the fields, but relentlessly hard, the kind of hard that accumulated. A cold snap that arrived earlier than expected, a sustained week of wet that turned to ice before it could drain away, a wind that came from the north with the specific patience of something that had decided to find every gap in every structure and make itself known. Elena had been planning for it since her first look at the ranch's winter stores. She had also been looking at the hands gear. What she found concerned her. 3 of the men had coats that were not adequate. This was not a small problem. Inadequate winter gear on a working ranch where people were outside for hours in below freezing temperatures was a problem that started as discomfort and could end as something worse. She had seen, on the road west, what happened to hands and feet and fingers when the cold was taken lightly. She raised it with Gideon. He listened. He told her what the budget was. She told him it wasn't enough to buy what was needed, but that it might be enough for materials if she made the coats herself. He looked at her for a moment. "You can do that in the time available?" "If I start now," she said. She started that same evening. She worked for 8 days, fitting in the work around everything else, staying up later than was wise, and rising earlier than was comfortable. She used a heavy canvas she bought from a peddler who came through and a wool batting she sourced from the Hesse farm, where Marta kept sheep and had some baled fleece she was willing to sell. The coats were not beautiful. They were shaped correctly for working men who needed to move freely, with reinforced elbows and a design along the front closure that made them significantly easier to do and undo with cold hands. When she gave them out, Frank O'Dara held his up and turned it around to look at the back, and then at the front, and then at the closures, and he said, "You thought about the closures?" "Buttons are a problem in the cold," she said. "The loops are easier." He looked at her with an expression that was no longer guarded. "Yeah," he said, "they are." Cal Brigham, who had lived through enough frontier winters to have strong opinions about cold weather gear, put his coat on immediately and fastened every closure and then unfastened them and fastened them again. He did this 4 times. Then he said, to no one in particular, "These'll do." From Cal Brigham, she had learned, this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The winter deepened. The work deepened with it. Elena found the rhythm of the ranch by feel, the way you learn the feel of a particular fabric, where it gave and where it held, what it could bear and what would damage it. She kept the supply records meticulously. She found 3 places where the household expenses had been quietly inflated by suppliers who had evidently decided over the years that a ranch without a careful eye on its accounts was a ranch worth overcharging. She corrected this without making it into a confrontation, simply switching to different suppliers where she could and renegotiating terms where she couldn't, with the specific patience of someone who knows exactly what the numbers say and doesn't need to raise her voice about it. The food got better. This was not glamorous, but it mattered. A working crew in a hard winter worked better on decent food than on food that was adequate, and Elena had a talent for stretching limited ingredients into meals that were at least interesting. She had learned this in the years of cooking alone on limited coin, and the skill transferred. The hands noticed. They didn't say much about it directly, most of them weren't the type, but she could track it in the quality of the mornings, in the way conversation at the table had shifted from functional to occasionally actual. She did not let herself think too much about whether this meant she was accepted. She knew better than that. What she had was provisional. She had shown them some things, and they had updated their opinions accordingly, but provisional was not permanent. And permanent was not something you could guarantee, only earn in increments. She was still earning. The widows of Black Ash Crossing did not stop. The rumors continued and evolved. When it became clear that the ranch was not immediately going to collapse under Elena's influence, which had apparently been one of the expected outcomes, the theories shifted to suggest that she was merely biding her time before she moved to extract Gideon's resources in some fashion, or that she was hiding some past that would eventually surface and destroy him by association. She heard these things in fragments, from Marta, from a word here and there. She did not go out of her way to hear them, but she also did not make the mistake of believing that because she wasn't listening, they weren't happening. She mentioned it to Gideon once, straight, one evening when they were both going through the week's accounts at the kitchen table. She said, "Carol Pemberton and the group around her aren't going to stop talking about us." He looked up from the ledger. "No," he agreed. "Probably not. I want to know if it starts to affect ranch business, not gossip, actual business." He considered that for a moment. "That's a fair line to draw." "It's not just protection," she said. "If someone's using the talk to get at the ranch directly, that's information I can work with. Gossip I can't do much about. A deliberate campaign I can." He looked at her steadily. "Do you think it's going to become a deliberate campaign?" She thought about Carol Pemberton's face on the porch of the general store, the particular quality of that tone. the effort of organizing other women around a shared grievance. "I think someone's putting a lot of energy into this," she said. "And people who put a lot of energy into something usually aren't done after a few weeks." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you need if it goes further?" She looked at the ledger. She looked at the window, where the winter dark pressed in close against the glass. "Right now? I just need you to keep doing what you're doing," she said. "Not defending me, just being consistent. People watch how you are with me more than they listen to what anyone says." He considered this with the particular quality she'd come to recognize as him actually processing something, rather than just waiting to respond. "That's true," he said. "All right." She went back to the accounts. Outside, the wind found the eave above the kitchen window and made a sound it only made in the hardest cold. Elena noted it, calculated it against the wood supply and the remaining weeks of likely hard weather, and wrote a small number in the margin of the page as a reminder to herself. There was always more to track than there was time to track it. That had been true in the cabin, and it was true here, just on a larger scale. She was good at scaling up. Cut it. By the end of that first winter, something had shifted. Not all the way, not cleanly, but shifted. The hands addressed her directly now, without the brief pause that had preceded their sentences before, the pause where she could feel them deciding how to speak to her. Cal Brigham had asked her opinion about the North Pasture fencing plan and had then incorporated her suggestion about the gate placement without commenting on the fact that he'd incorporated it, which was, she understood, his way of acknowledging it mattered. Frank O'Dara had brought her a cup of coffee one morning while she was working in the supply room and had set it down on the shelf near her without saying anything and had gone back out. She had drunk it. It was the way things happened in that world. Not with words usually, with gestures that carried meaning to people who were paying attention. She was always paying attention. What she didn't let herself examine too closely, not yet, was what was happening with Gideon himself. Not what she'd expected, which was the managed distance of two people in a practical arrangement. Something that was that, still, but also had other things in it that she didn't have clean names for. The way he told her things about the ranch without simplifying them. The way, twice now, he had asked her what she thought about something that was nothing to do with supplies or accounts or repairs. Once about a family that had come asking about renting the small house on the property's southeast corner, and once about a decision he was considering about one of the hands who had been struggling. He had wanted her actual assessment. She had given it straight the way he'd asked for. She thought about what he'd said at their first real conversation. That word, partnership. She was starting to understand what he'd meant by it. She was also starting to understand that it meant something more complicated than she'd taken it for at the time. But that was a thing to know slowly. She had learned that some things, pushed toward too fast, went crooked. The ones worth having were worth taking at the pace they needed. The winter broke eventually, the way winters always did, without ceremony, just incrementally retreating. The mud came, then the mud began to dry, and there was a morning in late March when she stepped outside and the air had lost that particular sharpness, and the light had changed and everything smelled like ground that was deciding to wake back up. She stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the early birds in the cottonwoods, looking at the mountains. She thought about Carol Pemberton. She thought about Douglas Crane. She thought about the way the town had looked at her when she walked through it, the assessment and the dismissal together in the same glance. She thought, "We're still here." It was not a triumphant thought. It was a quiet one. But she had learned that quiet and small was how most real things moved. Not in proclamations, not in dramatic gestures, but in the steady accumulation of days that held, of work that lasted, of trust built incrementally between people who were paying attention. She was still paying attention. She went inside to start the day. Spring came to Black Ash Crossing the way it always did in that part of the country. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with itself. Warm days interrupted by cold snaps that reminded you it wasn't done with winter yet. Mornings that smelled like thaw, followed by afternoons that froze what the thaw had loosened into something treacherous underfoot. Elena had come to appreciate this about the frontier seasons. They were honest. They didn't pretend to be finished before they were. The ranch came alive differently in spring. There was more noise, more movement, more of everything happening at once. The pastures needed assessing after the winter. Fences that had taken damage from the freeze needed finding and fixing. The horses were restless in a way they weren't during the cold months, and the whole operation shifted from the reduced, conserved pace of winter into something that had urgency in it. Elena shifted with it. She had spent the winter learning the ranch's rhythms, and she used that learning now, adjusting the supply orders to match the season, tracking what the men needed before they came to her to ask for it, keeping the accounts current so that when Gideon needed to make a decision quickly, there was always accurate information available to make it with. It was not glamorous work. She had not expected it to be. What she had not fully anticipated was how much it would be hers. Not in a formal or declared way. Gideon had not announced to anyone that Elena was managing the household operation, and she had not asked him to. It had simply become the case, organically, in the way that things that are being done well tend to accumulate more of themselves. Franco Dara started coming to her first when there was a supply question, before going to Gideon. Cal Brigham, who she had understood from the beginning was the real weather vane of the ranch's internal opinion, had asked her directly one April morning about the grain situation, speaking to her the way he spoke to Gideon, without softening, without explanation of what he thought she might not understand. And she had answered him the same way. She filed that morning away as a marker. But the town was a different terrain, and spring didn't improve it. The first concrete sign that Carol Pemberton's campaign had moved from social to practical came on a Tuesday in early April, when Elena rode in to place an order at Halverson's dry goods, and Halverson told her he was out of the wool serge she needed. She looked at him. She knew his stock. She had been buying from him since her first year in Black Ash Crossing, which meant she knew his ordering habits, his suppliers, and roughly what he kept in the back room. "When do you expect more?" she said. "Hard to say," Halverson said. He was a slight man with careful eyes, and those eyes were not quite meeting hers. "Supply's been irregular." "It's been irregular specifically for this item," she said, "or for your orders generally." A pause. "Generally," he said. She looked at him steadily. He looked at the counter. "I'll check back," she said. She checked back 3 times over the following 2 weeks. The serge remained unavailable. When she went to the other dry goods supplier in town, a smaller operation run by a woman named Bet Sanger, who had always been indifferent to Elena but never unfriendly, Betty told her, with the slightly pained look of someone doing something they'd been pressured into, that she was sorry, but she wasn't taking new orders right now. Elena rode back to the ranch and sat in her workshop for a while, thinking. She knew what this was. She had known it was coming, or something like it. What she was calculating now was the actual scope. How many suppliers, which categories of goods, and whether this was being coordinated or whether it was the kind of thing where one person's decision creates permission for others to make the same decision without being told to. Both possibilities had different implications. She brought it to Gideon that evening. 2 suppliers so far, she said. Possibly a third. I'm not certain about mead at the hardware yet, but something felt off last week. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the day's tallies in front of him, but he'd stopped looking at them. "What do you need that they won't sell you?" She gave him the list. It wasn't catastrophic, not yet. Everything on it was something she could route around at cost by ordering from suppliers in Merton or by finding alternatives. "I can manage the immediate supply problem," she said. "That's not what concerns me." "What concerns you?" "The pattern," she said. "If this continues expanding, it starts to affect the ranch's ability to operate normally, not just my ability to shop conveniently. And the intent is probably exactly that, to make Gideon Voss's operation visibly strained, in a way that people attribute to his choice of wife." She said it plainly. She had learned that he valued that. Gideon was quiet for a longer moment. She could see him working through it. "You think Carol Pemberton is organizing this?" "I think someone is," she said. "Carol has the motivation and the social position to make those calls. Whether it's her directly or someone working alongside her, the effect is the same." "I could go in and talk to Halverson. That helps for Halverson," she said. "It doesn't help for the next one, or the one after that. And it makes you look like you're fighting a battle that you're fighting because of me, which gives the narrative more weight, not less." He looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to recognize as him recalibrating. What do you want to do instead? I want to find out first, she said. Then I want to figure out what's actually driving this besides the obvious social grievance. Because in my experience, people who go this far usually have more than one reason. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. Find out. Finding out took time, and it required a resource Elena had not fully used yet. Marta Hesse. Marta was not a gossip in the pejorative sense. She was a woman who paid attention, who had lived in Black Ash Crossing long enough to understand its social architecture, and who had the specific quality of being genuinely liked by a broad range of people without appearing to seek it. She was the kind of person that other people forgot to guard themselves around, not because she encouraged it, but because there was nothing aggressive in her attention. Elena asked her directly to keep her ears open. I know that's a thing to ask, she said. They were in Marta's kitchen, over coffee, which was the format their friendship had gradually taken. I don't mean gossip for its own sake. I mean anything that sounds like it's about the ranch specifically, about the business. Not about me personally. Marta looked at her with the slightly narrowed eyes of someone thinking carefully. Can I ask why you think there's a difference? Because whatever this is, Elena said, it's more expensive than a social grievance. Someone's talking to merchants. That takes effort and probably some kind of leverage. That's not just wounded feelings. Marta was quiet for a moment, and then she said, There's a man who came to town around 2 months ago. Name of Aldrich Boone. He's been staying at the Crestfall Inn, which is unusual because nobody stays at the Crestfall Inn for 2 months unless they're waiting on something. He's been seen talking to Pemberton at least twice that I know of. Elena kept her expression neutral. What's he doing in Black Ash Crossing? He says he's a property consultant. Marta said the words with the slight emphasis of someone indicating that the official version and the actual version might be different things. He's been asking around about land values, water rights, who owns what, and whether anybody's been having a difficult time of it lately. Elena turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. That's useful, she said. I thought it might be. Back at the ranch, Elena put what she knew alongside what she could observe and let the picture develop the way you let a thing take its full shape before you react to it. Aldrich Boone was not the first of his type she'd encountered, though she'd known them by different names and in different places. They came to frontier towns looking for land that could be made available through pressure or debt or a combination of both. They looked for ranches that were already strained by bad years, by poor management, by the particular vulnerability that came from a transition in ownership or circumstance. They used social pressure as a tool, the way a good carpenter used a wedge, to open spaces that wouldn't open on their own. The marriage was the angle. She understood it now more completely. The whisper campaign about Elena was not only a social revenge project, it was a business maneuver. If the ranch could be made to look mismanaged, if Gideon Voss could be made to look like a man who had made a catastrophic personal judgment, if the hands could be made uncertain enough to leave, if the suppliers could be made difficult enough that the operation showed visible strain, then a man like Boone could arrive with an offer that was lower than the land's worth and frame it as a rescue. She sat with that understanding for a day before she told Gideon, not because she was uncertain, she was not uncertain, but because she wanted to be sure she had every piece she could assemble before she handed him something that would make him want to act immediately. She told him on a Friday evening, after the hands had eaten and the ranch had settled into its nighttime sounds. He's a land speculator, she said. The supplier refusals, the rumors, possibly some of the men's unease, I think it's all working toward the same pressure point. Make the ranch look troubled enough that you'd consider an offer. Gideon's face was very still. This was not, she had learned, a sign that he was calm. It was a sign that he was angry enough that he was being careful about it. Boone, he said, I can't prove it yet, but the timing and the pattern fit. Who's connecting him to Pemberton? I have one witness who's seen them together twice. That's not nothing, but it's not enough. She paused. I need more time. He was quiet for a moment. In the meantime, the suppliers, I'm routing around them, she said. It costs more for freight from Merton, but I've already made up most of the difference by finding where we were being overcharged by 2 other suppliers and correcting it. The accounts won't show strain if I keep ahead of it. He looked at her steadily. You've been managing this for 3 weeks without telling me. I was gathering information, she said. I didn't want to bring you something half-formed. He was quiet again. She watched him working through something. Is that why, or is it because you thought I'd go straight at Boone before we knew enough? She looked at him. Partly that, she said. He almost smiled. Not warmly, but there was something there. That's honest. I said I would be. So what do you need from me right now? Behave normally, she said. Ride into town the way you usually do. Do business the way you usually do. Don't give Boone anything that looks like reaction. What he needs is a signal that the pressure is working. Don't give it to him. She paused. And there's something I want to ask you that you might not like. Go ahead. The hands, she said, particularly the newer ones. 2 of them have been quieter lately. Tommy Reeves and a man called Holt who started in February. I want to know if they've been approached. Not accusation. I just want to know. He looked at her for a long moment. You want me to find out. I want you to create a situation where they'd tell you if something was wrong. You know them better than I do. You know how to do that. She paused. I'm not asking you to go at them directly. Just pay attention. I can do that, he said. He did it the next day, in the particular way she'd begun to understand was characteristic of him. Not a formal conversation, not a sit-down, but something woven into the normal work of the day. A question here and a quiet attention there, using the trust he'd built with these men over years of consistent dealing. He came back to her that evening and told her Holt had been approached, not by Boone directly, by an intermediary, a man he didn't know, who had told him that Gideon Voss's operation was on shaky ground and that men who moved on before things got bad were men who didn't end up out of work in the wrong season. Elena sat with that. He told you, she said. He told me, Gideon said. He was angry about it. That's good, she said. It means we still have the crew we think we have, and it means whoever's running this is trying to accelerate the timeline. Why would they accelerate? Because we haven't shown any cracks yet, she said. If the pressure was working, you'd be showing signs of it by now. We're not. So they'll push harder. The pushing came in several forms, arriving close enough together that Elena suspected they'd been coordinated. The first was a public one. Carol Pemberton hosted a gathering at her home, a Sunday afternoon social, the kind that was normal enough in frontier towns, and the guest list was specific. She invited every woman of standing in the valley, and she did not invite Elena. This alone was not remarkable, and Elena had not expected to be invited. What was remarkable was that during the gathering, according to Marta, who had been invited and had gone with the specific intention of listening, Carol had spoken openly about the state of Gideon Voss's ranch, using information that was too specific to be guesswork. She knew about the saddle repair, Marta told Elena afterward. Not just the saddle. She knew how many hands you still had and which ones she said were looking to move on. She knew you'd been having trouble with suppliers. Elena was very still. She knew how many hands. That's not something you'd hear from gossip, Marta said. That's operational information. No, Elena said, it's not. After Marta left, she went and sat in her workshop for a long time and thought about who had access to that kind of information. The answer was not a comfortable list. She did not want to believe it was a member of the crew. She also could not ignore the evidence, specific numbers, specific operational details that came from inside. She thought carefully about how to handle it. Going to Gideon immediately felt right, but might not be wise if the source was someone he was close to. She'd seen how badly mishandled suspicion could damage a crew worse than the original problem. She needed to be more certain. She set a simple test. She gave 3 different people slightly different pieces of information. Not false information, just different framings of the same fact, each framing unique enough to be traceable. Then she waited. It took 8 days. What came back to Marta, through the social network of the town, matched the framing she'd given to one specific person, a young hand named Denny Croft, who had been with the ranch for 7 months, and who she had, in retrospect, noticed always seemed to be nearby when she was working through the accounts. She told Gideon. He was quiet for a long time after she finished, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. You're sure, he said. I'm sure of the test, she said. The interpretation is yours to make. He rode out the next morning and spoke to Croft alone, away from the other men. She didn't ask what was said. Croft was gone by afternoon, and Gideon came back and sat at the kitchen table and didn't speak for a while, and she brought him coffee and sat across from him and let the silence be what it needed to be. He said he needed money, Gideon said finally. Boone paid him. I'm sorry, she said. And she meant it. Not for Croft exactly, but for the particular way it felt to find out that someone you'd trusted was trading in your trust for coin. He was here 7 months, Gideon said. I know. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You figured it out in 8 days. I had a narrow enough field to work with, she said. I got lucky on the timing. He looked at her across the table. That's not luck, he said. She didn't argue the point, but she noted it. Chet, the second form the pressure took was more direct and considerably more damaging. In the last week of April, the ranch's main water trough in the east pasture turned. Not poison, she didn't want to use a word she couldn't prove, but something had contaminated it badly enough that 3 horses showed signs of sickness over 2 days. And until she figured out what was wrong, they had to pull the horses from that pasture entirely, which disrupted the spring rotation she'd planned and created a cascade of problems with the grazing schedule. She and Frank Odera went to the trough together and looked at it. Something got in here, Frank said. He was crouched at the edge, looking at the surface, and his expression had a particular quality she recognized as a man who has seen a bad thing and is working out whether it was bad luck or bad intent. She was looking at the ground around the trough, at the marks in the soft April mud, at the pattern of them. More than one person, she said. Frank looked at where she was looking. He was quiet for a moment. That's deliberate. That's deliberate, she agreed. She did not have proof of who. What she had was a contaminated trough, sick horses, a disrupted operation, and a speculator in town who needed the ranch to be visibly failing. The connection was not proof, but it was a direction. She told Gideon when he came back from the north pasture. His face did that still thing again. The horses, 2 of them will be fine in a few days, she said. The third one I'm less certain about. I've got Frank monitoring her. She paused. This is escalating, Gideon. Whoever is doing this, Boone or people hired by Boone, they're moving from social pressure to direct interference. Oh, that's a line, he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not loud, but with a specific edge. It is, she said. And I need you to stay on the right side of it. I know that's hard to hear right now. He looked at her. You want me to do nothing. I want you to not go into town and find Boone and do something that gives him a reason to involve a sheriff or a lawyer, she said, because that's what he wants. He wants you reactive. He wants you doing something he can use. She held his gaze. I'm not done gathering what I need. Give me more time. He breathed. She could see him choosing it deliberately, the way you choose something against your own instinct because you've decided to trust a different judgment than your own. How much time? He said. As little as I can manage, she said. She worked faster after that. Marta came through again with something she'd almost not mentioned because she wasn't sure it was relevant. Aldrich Boone had been seen twice with a man named Cutter, who was not from Black Ash Crossing and who Marta's husband had identified as someone who had been connected, a few years ago, and a couple of towns over, to a water rights dispute that had ended badly for the ranch owner and well for a land buyer. Elena sent a letter to the county land office in the direction of that other town, using the specific careful language of someone asking about public record without triggering attention. She got a reply in 12 days. She read it twice and then put it in the flat drawer in her workshop behind the pattern paper with the one other document she'd quietly assembled over the past weeks. She was building something. She needed it to hold when it was time to use it. In the meantime, she kept the accounts clean. She kept the supply chain functioning through the rerouted suppliers in Merton. She kept the hands paid and fed and as insulated from the external noise as she could manage. She fixed what needed fixing and tracked what needed tracking. One evening, Cal Brigham stopped her near the barn. He had a habit of appearing at the edges of things, like he just happened to be there, and she'd learned that this was actually his way of creating a conversation without having to formally seek it out. "You're holding this place together," he said. He said it to the middle distance, not exactly to her, in the manner of a man making an observation rather than a compliment. "We're holding it together," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "But you know which thread to pull and which one leaves the whole thing." He looked at her briefly. "That's not nothing." She thought about that for a while after he walked away. She thought about the letter in her drawer and about the second document and about Aldrich Boone in his room at the Crestfall Inn, probably calculating that the ranch was close enough to its breaking point now to move on. She thought he was wrong about that. She was also aware that being right about it was going to require more than being careful. It was going to require being willing to take a risk she hadn't fully decided she was ready for yet. The kind of risk where you had to let things get worse before they got better, where you had to give the enemy enough room to show themselves completely. She hadn't decided yet. But she was close. The horses recovered, 2 of them fully within a week. The third one, the mare she'd been worried about, took longer. She checked on her each morning herself, before the rest of the work started, standing in the stall in the early light, running her hands along the horse's flank and watching how she moved. By the end of the second week, the mare was eating properly again. Elena stood in the barn doorway in the gray early morning and let herself feel that for a moment. The specific, unglamorous satisfaction of a thing not lost that might have been. Then she went inside to start the accounts. The letter from the county land office had been sitting in Elena's drawer for 3 weeks by the time she fully understood what it meant. She had read it carefully on the day it arrived, and then again the next morning, and she had understood its surface meaning immediately. The water rights dispute in the town of Callow Creek 2 years prior had ended with a ranch owner named Gerald Pruitt signing over his property at roughly 40% of its assessed value, following a period of what the records described neutrally as operational difficulties. Aldrich Boone's name did not appear in the public record. The buyer of record was a landholding company called Terrace Mountain Properties, which was a name that meant nothing until she wrote it down and looked at it alongside the other document in her drawer. A bill of sale receipt she had found, folded into the lining of Denny Croft's work jacket, which he had left behind in his bunk when Gideon had let him go. The receipt was for surveying equipment. It was issued to Terrace Mountain Properties, and it listed a Black Ash Crossing address. She sat in her workshop in the early morning with both documents on the table in front of her, and the lamp turned up, and thought about what she was looking at. Boone had not come to Black Ash Crossing opportunistically. He had come with preparation. The surveying equipment meant he had already been mapping the Voss property, probably from a distance, probably for longer than 2 months. The connection to Callow Creek meant this was a pattern, not a single event. He had done this before, used social pressure and sabotage to soften a ranch until it was ready to sell cheap, and he had a company structure in place to receive the title. This was not a man improvising. This was a man executing a process he had refined. She put both documents back in the drawer and went out to start the morning. She told Gideon that evening. All of it, laid out in the order she'd assembled it, without interpretation until she'd given him every piece. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he listened when something mattered. When it didn't matter, he asked questions partway through. But when it did, he went still and let it all come before he responded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's done this before," he said. "At least once that I can document," she said. "Possibly more. The land company structure suggests he didn't build it for one transaction." "What happened to the man in Callow Creek?" "He's not in Callow Creek anymore," she said. "I don't know where he is." Gideon turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did this when he was thinking, she had noticed. Not restlessly, just something for his hands to do while his mind worked. "And you think Pemberton knows what Boone actually is?" "I think she knows he's useful to her," Elena said. "Whether she knows the full extent of it, whether she understands that she's being used as a tool in a land acquisition scheme, as much as he's using her grievance as cover, I'm less certain about." She paused. "It's possible she does know. It's possible she has an arrangement with him. Or it's possible she's simply a woman who wanted me gone badly enough that she didn't ask careful questions about who was offering to help. Which is worse for us." She thought about that honestly. If she's fully in it, she's more dangerous. If she's not, she's more likely to fracture under pressure. She looked at him. "I don't know yet which it is." He set down the cup. What do you want to do? This was the question she had been working toward, and also the question she had been most uncertain about, because what she had assembled was enough to understand the threat, but not yet enough to stop it. Not in a way that stuck, not in a way that couldn't be denied or reframed or buried under legal complexity. She could go to the county sheriff with what she had, but a bill of sale receipt and a land office record from another town was not the kind of evidence that made officials move quickly. And if Boone knew she had gone to the sheriff, he would move faster, change his approach, make himself harder to reach. I want to catch him, she said. Not just expose him, catch him. Gideon looked at her carefully. Meaning, I want him to make his move while we're ready for it, she said, not while we're still reacting. She held his gaze. The pressure he's been applying hasn't broken us, and he knows that now. He's going to escalate one more time. Something more direct than the water trough, more visible, something designed to create a crisis that looks like it justifies a fast sale. I think we have maybe 2 or 3 weeks before he does it. And you want to let him. I want to be ready when he does, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet again. She could see him working through it. Not the logistics, which was her terrain, and he understood that, but the thing underneath, which was whether he trusted her enough to hold still while someone came for what was his. What do you need from me? He said finally. 2 things, she said. First, I need you to ride into town next week and make it visible that you're worried, not panicked. Just let it show that there's been strain. Enough that Boone's informants, whoever's left, will tell him the timing is right. He didn't like that. She could see it. And the second thing, when it happens, she said, I need you to trust me to handle the first part of it alone, before you come in. He looked at her for a long time across the kitchen table. The lamp between them was burning low. She should have trimmed the wick that morning and had forgotten, and the light it gave was unsteady. She didn't look away from him. All right, he said. What? She went to see Marta the next day, and the conversation she had with her was the one she had been building toward for weeks. I need you to hear something, and then I need you to let it travel, she said. Marta looked at her with the careful eyes of a woman who had been asked to carry information before and understood the weight of it. What kind of something? The kind that's mostly true, Elena said. The ranch is having cash flow trouble. The winter was harder than expected, and some of the supply problems have left gaps. Gideon is considering what options are available. Marta was quiet. That's not entirely false. No, Elena said. It's not entirely false. What I need is for it to reach Boone in a way that sounds like something overheard rather than something planted. Can you do that without compromising yourself? Marta thought about it. There's a Tuesday gathering at the Pierce house. Carol Pemberton attends. If I mention it to Helen Oates while Carol's in earshot, Helen is the worst secret keeper in this valley. That's not an exaggeration. It'll be at the Crestfall Inn by Thursday. Thursday is good, Elena said. Elena, Marta said, what happens after Thursday? Hopefully, Elena said, something I've prepared for. What? What she had been doing quietly for the 2 weeks prior was the work that nobody saw. She had started with the barn. Frank O'Dara had been puzzled when she asked him about the roof access in the equipment barn, not the main livestock barn, the one adjacent to it that housed the heavier machinery and the winter feed reserves. And she had explained that she was concerned about the structural integrity of the left front beam after the wet spring, which was true enough that it wasn't a lie, just incomplete. He had shown her the access, and she had gone up and confirmed the structural concern, and also mapped, carefully and privately, the sight lines from the roof to the main gate in the eastern approach road. She had inventoried the escape routes. There were 3 from the main house, not counting windows, and she had tested all of them at night, walking them in the dark to understand what you could and couldn't see in which kind of light. One of them came out behind the old smokehouse, which she had observed was never in anyone's line of sight from the road. She had checked the padlocks on every outbuilding and replaced 2 that were rusted to the point of uncertainty with better ones she'd ordered from Merton. She had reorganized the tool storage so that the most useful items were accessible without having to move things to reach them. None of this looked like preparation if you weren't looking for it. It looked like someone running a ranch carefully. She had also written 2 letters. One to the county sheriff in the seat town, detailing what she knew about Boone and Terrace Mountain properties and the Callow Creek transaction, and asking for a response within 2 weeks. One to a lawyer in the same town whose name she had gotten from the county clerk's records. A man named Aldous Fenn, who appeared to have handled several property disputes, and who she had no relationship with at all, which was fine, because what she needed was not a relationship but a professional who could receive documents. She sent copies of both documents in her drawer, the letter and the receipt, with each letter. Then she waited. Gideon rode into town on a Wednesday, as she had asked. She had briefed him on what visible worry looked like without tipping into performance. A slight tension in how he handled routine business, a pause before answering when someone asked how the ranch was doing, a suggestion that he might be looking at adjusting his operation for the coming year. Nothing stated directly, just the texture of a man managing something difficult. He came back and reported that Douglas Crane had been unusually friendly and that a man he didn't recognize had been watching from outside the feed store while he handled his business. "Describe him," she said. The description matched what she knew of Cutter, Boone's associate. "Good," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite comfortable. "I don't like being watched," he said. "I know," she said. "You're almost done needing to be." Chink. The response from the county sheriff came 9 days later. It was not, as she had half feared, a polite dismissal. It was a letter from a deputy named Harlow Speck, who wrote in the curt, efficient style of someone who had limited time and was telling her directly that the name Terrace Mountain Properties was known to his office, that there were ongoing inquiries she was not at liberty to know the details of, and that if she had documentation, real documentation, originals, she should hold them and be prepared to surrender them on short notice. She read the letter twice and put it with the others. So the sheriff's office knew about Boone. That changed the timeline. It meant that whatever Boone was planning, he was planning it against a backdrop where his exposure was closer than he knew. It also meant that if she could get him to make his move on record, there would be people with actual authority ready to act on it. She went out to the barn and found Frank O'Dara mending a fence section that had been brought in for repairs. "Frank," she said, "I need to talk to you and Cal together, tonight, after supper." He looked at her. He had a particular way of reading situations, not fast but reliable, and she could see him reading this one. "How serious?" he said. "Serious enough that I want you to know before it happens rather than while it's happening," she said. "All right," he said. That evening she told them what she needed them to know. Not everything, because there were pieces that were better kept small, but enough. She told them there was likely to be a direct action against the ranch within the next week or two. She told them it would come fast, and it would be designed to look like crisis, and that the most important thing they and the crew could do was not react the way the people behind it expected them to react. Cal Brigham listened with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed somewhere past her left shoulder, which was his thinking posture. When she finished, he said, "You want us steady." "I want you steady," she said, "and I want you to know where everything is. The exit from the equipment barn, the back way behind the smokehouse, the 2 water barrels I've had filled and staged near the east fence." Frank O'Dara was looking at the water barrels she was describing, and she saw him register what they were staged for. "You're expecting fire," he said. "I'm expecting whatever makes the most dramatic picture," she said. "Fire is one option. I don't know which. I'm staging for several." Cal unfolded his arms. "You've been planning this a while," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the particular measuring quality that was his version of respect, not warmly, but directly. "What do you need from us the night it goes?" "Hold your positions," she said. "Protect the livestock above everything else. Don't engage directly with anyone who comes onto the property unless they're an immediate physical threat. And if they are, protect yourself, but don't escalate beyond that. What I need is witnesses, not fighters." "And you," Frank said, "where will you be?" "Where I need to be," she said. Men. The nights that followed were long in a particular way. Elena slept lightly and woke at sounds and lay in the dark, listening to the ranch's nighttime vocabulary. The horses, the cottonwoods, the particular creak of the house settling, and calibrating each sound against what it should and shouldn't be. Gideon was aware of this. He didn't say much about it, which was his way, But she was conscious on some of those wakeful nights of movement in the hallway, his door, the quiet sound of someone else also not sleeping. They had begun, in these months, to occupy each other's awareness in ways that had not been part of the original arrangement, and she thought about that sometimes in those dark hours, not with the particular weight of a decision to be made, but with a kind of plain acknowledgement that things were not what they had been. On the fourth night of her extended watchfulness, he appeared in the kitchen doorway when she was sitting at the table in the early hours, and he sat down across from her without asking and put the lamp on, and they sat together for a while without talking, and that was its own kind of thing. "You're not sleeping," he said eventually. "I sleep a little," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying most of this," he said. It wasn't quite an apology. It was more like something he'd been sitting with and was saying out loud because not saying it had stopped being an option. "It's what I'm good at," she said. "That's not an answer." She looked at him across the lamp. His face in that light looked like a man who had stopped trying to keep something at a distance. She didn't entirely know what to do with that. "I'm not carrying it alone," she said. "You've done everything I've asked you to. That's not nothing." "It doesn't feel like enough," he said. "It is," she said. "Right now it is." He nodded slowly. He didn't push further. She was grateful for that, and for a different reason than the obvious one. It happened on a Thursday night, 11 days after Marta had delivered the planted information. Elena had been half asleep when she heard the horses, not the usual sounds, but the particular quality of unease that moved through a herd when something was wrong with the air around them. She was up and dressed before she'd consciously decided to be, the instinct running ahead of the thought. She went to the window first. The night was dark and the sky had a thick cover of clouds that had been building since late afternoon, and the air had that particular flatness that came before weather. Not a storm yet, but something deciding to become one. She could see the outline of the equipment barn against the slightly less dark sky, and she could see that the gate on the far side of the east pasture, which she had made sure was correctly closed before dark, was now open. She did not go wake Gideon immediately. She had told him she needed to handle the first part alone, and she had told him that for a reason. She went out the back of the house, through the side door that came out near the woodpile, and she moved along the edge of the structure toward the equipment barn. She had walked this route a dozen times in the dark. She knew where the soft ground was and where it wasn't, and she moved without sound in the way that people move when they've been poor enough that they learned young not to draw attention to themselves in the night. She got to the equipment barn and went up the side access to the roof. From the roof, she could see what was happening. There were 3 men she didn't recognize near the south fence, moving with the particular purpose of people who have been told what to do and are doing it. One of them was near the trough that had been contaminated in April, refilled and cleaned, and she had added something to the water in the last 3 days that would make it obvious if it was interfered with again. The second was carrying something she couldn't identify at this distance. The third was by the gate, and standing at the edge of the property, far enough back to be at the edge of visibility, was Aldrich Boone. She had never seen him clearly before. She had a description from Marta and from Gideon's account of the man outside the feed store, and the figure at the edge of the property matched it. Medium height, dressed too well for the work being done around him, standing with the particular stillness of a man who does not get his own hands dirty. She watched for 2 minutes. She let him be there. She let his men do what they had come to do. She watched the one with the object she couldn't identify move toward the equipment barn's side door, and she watched him produce a lockpick, which told her several things at once, including that they had done their reconnaissance well enough to know the barn's layout, but not quite well enough to know that she'd changed the lock last week. When he couldn't get the door open, she watched the 3 men confer quietly. She watched one of them look back toward Boone. This was the moment. She stood up on the roof of the equipment barn, not hiding, not moving quietly. And she called out, clearly, and without raising her voice more than she had to, "Mr. Boone!" The 3 men below her startled hard. One of them dropped what he was carrying. She looked down at it from the roof and saw that it was a metal canister, the kind used for lamp oil, and she noted that in the deliberate way she had been noting everything for weeks. Boone, at the edge of the property, did not startle. She gave him that. He went still, which was different. "You can leave the canister where it is," she said, still calm, still not shouting. And you can ask your men to step back from the fence. A pause. The men looked at Boone. Boone looked at Elena on the roof. Mrs. Voss, he said. His voice was smooth and had the quality of a man who was recalculating. I'm afraid there's been some confusion. There hasn't been, she said. There's a deputy from the county sheriff's office who has been expecting documentation from me for 11 days. I sent him originals this afternoon. He'll have them tomorrow morning. She paused. You're on private property after dark with a canister of lamp oil near a working barn. Whatever confusion you were planning to claim, I'd think carefully about whether it's going to hold. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man's plan failing to find its footing. We were just, one of the other men started. I know what you were just, Elena said. She did not look at the man who had spoken. She kept looking at Boone. I've been watching you for 8 weeks, Mr. Boone. I know about Terrace Mountain Properties. I know about Callow Creek and Gerald Pruitt. I know about Denny Croft and what you paid him. I know about the water trough in April. I have documentation on all of it. She paused. And I have witnesses tonight. From behind her, from the direction of the smokehouse, she heard Cal Brigham say, in his particular carrying flatness, That'd be right. And Frank O'Dara, from the corner of the main barn. 5 of us out here, Mrs. Voss. Boone looked at the barn. He looked at the smokehouse. He looked up at Elena on the roof. She watched him doing the arithmetic, and she watched him arrive at the number that told him what his situation was. The 3 men he'd brought were already backing toward the open gate. Boone did not back away immediately. He looked at her for another moment, and she held the look steadily, and then he turned and walked toward the road with the deliberate pace of a man trying to look like he was choosing to leave rather than retreating. She watched until he was out of sight. Then she sat down on the roof of the equipment barn in the dark, and put her hands on her knees, and noticed that they were not quite steady. She gave them a moment. The horses had begun to quiet below her. The clouds overhead were thicker now, and she could smell rain coming. The real kind, not the threatening kind, the kind that actually arrived. Gideon appeared at the base of the barn and looked up. I heard, he said. He meant the confrontation. He had been inside holding to what she'd asked of him, and she understood what that had cost him. I know, she said. Come up here. He climbed up. He sat beside her on the barn roof and looked out at the dark property. The south fence, the open gate that one of the hands was already moving to close, the shape of the land that had been his for years and that someone had been systematically trying to take from him. Is it done? He said. The night part is done, she said. The rest will take a few more weeks. The deputy will come, and there will be questions, and it'll need to go through the right channels. But Boone knows the documentation exists. Men like that don't push past documentation. Documentation is what they specifically avoid. He'll look for an easier situation. Gideon was quiet. She could feel the tension in him settling, not quickly but by degrees, the way something under sustained pressure releases when the pressure is finally removed. You told me to trust you to handle the first part alone, he said. You did, she said. I almost didn't, he said. I know, she said. The first drops of rain started then, light enough at first that she wasn't immediately sure, and then heavier, and she tilted her face up into it because she had been sitting still for a long time, and it felt like the right response to rain after a long, dry tension. Beside her, Gideon didn't move. We should go inside, he said. Yes, she said. Neither of them moved immediately. The rain came down on the Voss ranch, on the repaired barn, and the reinforced fences and the recovered horses in the pasture, on the 8 months of work that had been done quietly and without announcement, on the people who had decided to stay when they could have left. It came down the way things did in this country, not gently, but thoroughly, covering everything equally, making no distinction between what had been there before and what had been recently built. She thought, sitting on the roof in the rain, that she would remember this particular kind of quiet for a long time. Then Gideon said, Elena, and she looked at him, and he didn't say anything else. And she understood that the thing he'd started to say was a thing that didn't have clean words for it yet, and she nodded once, and that was enough. They climbed down from the roof and went inside out of the rain. The rain that had come down on the ranch that Thursday night did not stop until well past dawn, and by morning the yard was soft, and the road into Black Ash Crossing had turned to the particular kind of mud that pulled at a horse's hooves and made everything take longer than it should. Elena was up before the light fully arrived, as she had been every morning for the past 2 months. But this morning felt different in a way that was hard to name exactly. Not relief, not yet, because she knew better than to call something finished before it was finished, but something in the register of pressure released. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the 2 remaining documents she hadn't yet sent, copies she'd kept for herself, the originals now in the hands of Deputy Harlow Speck somewhere in the county seat. And she went through them one more time, not because she expected to find anything new, but because going through things carefully was how she made sure she hadn't missed anything, and she had not come this far by assuming she was done when something merely felt done. Frank O'Dara knocked on the kitchen door at 6:30, which he had never done before. She said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and mud on his boots, and the expression of a man who has a thing to say and is working out the right order of it. "The men want you to know," he said, "what you did last night, how you handled it. We want you to know we saw it." She looked at him. She understood what it had taken for Frank O'Dara, who was not a man who spoke easily about what things meant to him, to stand in the kitchen doorway at 6:30 in the morning and say something like that. "Thank you, Frank," she said. He nodded, once, and went back out. She sat with that for a moment. Then she drank her coffee and went back to her documents. Deputy Harlow Speck arrived 3 days later, on a Sunday, which surprised her. She had not expected official business on a Sunday, and it told her something about how the sheriff's office was treating this, which was seriously and with some urgency. He was younger than she had pictured from his letter, mid-30s, lean, with the particular weathered quality of a man who spent significant time outdoors, and the equally particular quality of someone who was accustomed to walking into situations that were already in motion and having to understand them quickly. He arrived with another deputy, whose name she didn't catch and who said almost nothing during the entire visit. She brought them inside. Gideon was there, and she had asked Cal Brigham to be present as well, on the basis that having a witness who wasn't a Voss was useful. Speck went through the documents she gave him with a focused attention that she respected. He asked precise questions, not fishing questions. He asked about the specific timeline of the water trough incident, about how she had obtained the Croft receipt, about the exact words Boone had spoken during the confrontation on the roof. He made notes in a small book with a methodical efficiency that suggested the notes would actually be usable afterward. At one point, he looked up from the documents and said, "How long have you been building this?" "Since about 6 weeks after I understood what was happening," she said. He considered that. "Most people in your situation would have gone to the sheriff at the first sign of trouble." "Most people in my situation would have had less to bring when they did," she said, "and would have given him time to disappear." Speck looked at her for a moment with the steady professional appraisal of someone recalibrating. Then he went back to his notes. When he was done, he told them what he could tell them. Boone's operation had been under observation from his office for several months, following a complaint from a rancher in a different county that bore similarities to what had happened in Callow Creek. What Elena had provided was the kind of specific documentary connective tissue that the investigation had been missing. The company name on the receipt linking to a known pattern of acquisition, the paid informant establishing a pattern of deliberate interference rather than opportunistic fraud. It didn't complete the case by itself, but it was, Speck said in the careful way of a man who can't promise outcomes, the most concrete material anyone had given them. "What happens to Boone now?" Gideon said. "We'll be paying him a visit," Speck said. "What happens after that depends on what he decides to do when we do." He picked up his hat. "I'd suggest not leaving the property unoccupied for the next week or two. Men like Boone, when they feel the net tightening, sometimes make decisions that aren't in their own interest." After the deputies left, Gideon stood on the porch and looked at the road for a moment. Elena stood beside him. "He's going to run," Gideon said. "Boone." "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. Running creates its own problems for him, abandons whatever investment he's put into this. He might calculate that he can still find a way through." "Can he?" She thought about the documents in Speck's possession, about the 3 men who had been on the property Thursday night, two of whom she had gotten a clear enough look at to describe with reasonable accuracy, and one of whom had dropped a lamp oil canister that was now in the equipment barn with a piece of cloth over it that she had not let anyone touch. She thought about Marta, who had witnessed Carol Pemberton's conversations, and Holt, who had been approached by Boone's intermediary and who had told Gideon directly. "No," she said. "I don't think he can." What happened next did not happen cleanly or in a satisfying sequence. Real things rarely did. What happened was that Deputy Speck went to the Crestfall Inn on Monday morning and found that Aldrich Boone had checked out on Friday, the morning after the confrontation at the ranch, before Elena's documents had even reached Speck's office. He had left no forwarding information. He had settled his bill in cash, which Speck noted was what people did when they wanted no paper trail, and he had taken everything with him that was traceable. Speck sent word to the Voss Ranch by Tuesday. Elena read the note and set it on her work table and sat with it. He had run. She had expected one possibility or the other, and she had prepared for both, but there was still something that settled in her stomach when it was confirmed. Not quite disappointment, because she had not been naive about outcomes, but the specific frustration of watching a man escape the most immediate consequences of what he had done. She thought about Gerald Pruitt in Callow Creek, who was no longer in Callow Creek. She thought about what Pruitt's version of this story had been, and whether it had ended the way she would have wanted it to end if she were him. She folded the note and put it with the other documents and went out to find Gideon. He was in the north pasture with Tommy Reeves, looking at the fence line, and he read the note when she brought it to him and then handed it back and looked at the mountains. She watched him working through the same calculations she had worked through. "He got away," Tommy said, and then looked as if he wished he hadn't said it out loud. "From here," Elena said. "He got away from here." She looked at Gideon. "Speck has the documentation. The company name is in their records now. He can check out of a hotel, but he can't check out of a county investigation." "That's not the same as consequences," Gideon said. "No," she said. "It's not the same. But it's not nothing either." She paused. "And there's still Pemberton." Boss. Carol Pemberton had, Elena suspected, no idea yet what had happened on Thursday night. The social network of Black Ash Crossing moved efficiently, but not instantly, and the confrontation at the ranch had happened in the dark and the rain with no townspeople present. What would reach Carol first would be fragments. That something had happened, that men had been on Voss property, that Boone had left the Crestfall. Elena wanted to manage which fragments arrived in which order and what context they arrived in. She went to see Marta. "I need a favor," she said. "The last one like this, I think." Marta looked at her with the expression she had developed over these months, which was the expression of someone who has decided to be useful to a person they've come to respect, but who reserves the right to ask questions. "What kind?" "I need the truth about Thursday night to arrive in the right place at the right time," Elena said. "Not a planted story. The actual truth in accurate detail told to someone who will tell Carol Pemberton before Pemberton has a chance to construct her own version of it." "You want her to know what happened before she can decide what she thinks happened," Marta said. "Yes." "Why does the order matter?" Elena thought about how to say it. "Because if she hears first that Boone is gone and the ranch is fine, she'll reframe it. She'll tell herself and everyone else that she had nothing to do with any of it, that she doesn't know what this Boone person was involved in, that she was simply a woman who had concerns about a hasty marriage and expressed them socially." She paused. "But if she hears the full account first, what Boone brought onto the property, what he intended, what Elena Voss was standing on a barn roof in the rain holding together while Boone's men tried to burn the evidence, then she has to hear it in the context of what she was part of." Marta was quiet for a moment. "You want her to know that you know," she said, "and you want the town to see that she knows." "I want the truth to have a fair chance to land before it gets managed," Elena said. Marta picked up her coffee cup. She held it without drinking from it. "Helen Oates is having people to tea on Thursday," she said. "Carol will be there." She looked at Elena. "If I go to that tea and tell what I witnessed, what I personally saw and heard, nothing more, it'll be in that room in the way you're describing." "That's all I'm asking," Elena said. "All right," Marta said. She did not attend the tea. She was not invited, and she would not have gone if she had been. But she heard about it afterward from Marta, and the account was thorough. Marta had told it simply, in the way that the most effective telling usually worked. Not dramatically, not building to a point, just what she had seen and heard, in order. The scene at the barn roof, Boone at the edge of the property, the lamp oil canister on the ground, Elena's voice in the dark, calm, calling out a name and laying out what she knew. The 5 ranch hands who had been positioned and waiting. The documentation already in the mail to the sheriff's office. The tea had gone quiet during this account, in the way that rooms go quiet when something lands and everyone is privately rearranging what they thought they knew. Carol Pemberton, according to Marta, had said nothing for a long moment, and then she had said, "I didn't know what he was planning to do." The room had not responded to that the way she had apparently expected it to respond. "What did you say?" Elena asked. "I said," Marta told her, "that I was sure that was true, and that it was probably also true that a man like Boone would have been very careful about what he told the people who were useful to him." She paused. "And I said that I supposed if someone had thought to ask more carefully who they were being useful to, it might have saved some trouble." Elena looked at Marta. "That was more pointed than I expected from you," she said. "I have been patient with that woman for a long time," Marta said, with the particular serenity of someone who has said a thing they have been waiting a while to say and has no regret about it. But what followed was not a dramatic reckoning. There was no public confrontation, no scene in the middle of the street. What there was instead was a shift in the town's weather, the social kind, the kind that was harder to point to directly, but that Elena could feel as clearly as the actual weather, because she had learned to read both. Douglas Crane stopped requiring that Gideon confirm her purchases in person. He didn't say anything about it. He simply stopped requiring it. She placed an order one Tuesday morning, and he wrote it down and told her the delivery day, and that was the whole transaction. Halverson's Dry Goods had the wool serge back in stock inside of 2 weeks, and when she came in for it, he was carefully, deliberately normal with her. Not over-friendly, not apologetic, just normal. The way he would have been with anyone who came in to buy fabric. And she understood that normal was the most he was going to manage, and it was enough. The woman who had crossed the street to avoid her in those early months nodded to her now when they passed. Didn't stop, didn't speak, but nodded. Elena counted it. There were, she was honest with herself, people in Black Ash Crossing who would never fully update their opinion of her. People who had decided what she was in the first days and found too much invested in that decision to revise it now. She was not naive about this. She had not expected universal acceptance as an outcome, and she did not feel the lack of it as failure. What she felt as something close to victory was simpler and more specific, the ability to move through the town doing what she needed to do without it being made into a resistance exercise every time. That had been the actual goal. Everything else was additional. Set. It was Cal Brigham who brought her the news about Boone. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, 3 weeks after the confrontation on the roof. He came to find her in the workshop and stood in the doorway the way he always stood in doorways, taking up the frame without quite leaning on it. "Heard something from a man who came through from Merton," he said, "about that speculator." She set down the leather work she'd been doing. "Tell me." "They took him in," Cal said, "down near the county line. Had warrants. Something about the property company and some kind of fraud." He paused. "Didn't hear the details. Just that he's not going to be renting rooms at inns for a while." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "I did," she said. "Thank you, Cal." He nodded and left. She sat with it for a while. It was not triumphant, the way she'd imagined triumph might feel when she was planning and preparing and not sleeping through the dark hours. It was quieter than that. It was closer to the feeling she'd had watching the sick mare eat properly again after 2 weeks of uncertainty. The specific relief of a thing resolved, not perfectly, not cleanly, but resolved. She picked up the leather work and kept going. The community meeting was not her idea. It was Gideon's. He proposed it one evening in late June with the matter-of-fact delivery of a man who has been thinking about something and has arrived at a conclusion. "I want to hold a meeting," he said. "Not a celebration, just people in the valley, come together, talk about what happened and where the ranch stands and what it means going forward." She looked at him across the kitchen table. Why? Because there are families out here who almost made decisions based on a false picture of things, he said, about whether the valley was stable, whether the ranch was viable, whether the word of a man like Boone meant anything. I want them to have the actual picture. She thought about it. Some of those families are going to be uncomfortable sitting in a room where the real picture requires them to acknowledge they were wrong about some things. Probably, he said. I'm not asking them to say it out loud. She considered the value of it against the risk of it, which was what she did with most things. I'll need to prepare what I say. He looked at her. You'll speak? You said it was a community meeting, she said. If I hide in the kitchen while you address the community, what does that say about anything we've done this year? He was quiet for a moment. Then, fair enough. The meeting happened on a Saturday in early July at the larger of Black Ash Crossing's 2 gathering spaces, a hall attached to the town's civic building that was used for things that needed more room than a room could provide. It was not overflowing, but it was fuller than Elena had expected, which told her something about the amount of unresolved feeling people were carrying around about what had happened. Gideon spoke first. He spoke the way he always spoke, which was directly and without ornamentation, laying out what had happened on his property and what had been discovered about Boone and Terrace Mountain properties, and the pattern of what that company had done to other ranchers in other places. He said it without anger in his voice, which was more effective, she thought, than if he'd said it with anger. Then she spoke. She had prepared for it, and she had also decided that prepared only got you so far, and that the rest had to be honest in a way that couldn't be rehearsed. She stood at the front of the room. She did not go behind the table that was set up there. She stood in front of it, which meant she was visible and unshielded, which was the point. And she looked at the room and she said, I know some of you have had questions about me since I came to this ranch. I'm not going to pretend those questions didn't exist or that I haven't known about them. She paused. What I'm going to tell you is what I did and why I did it, and you can make of it what you want. She told them about the supply refusals and what she had understood them to mean, about the water trough and what she'd found in the ground around it, about Denny Croft and how she'd identified him. And she said this without particular hardness because Croft had been a young man in a difficult position, and the person who had put him in that position was Boone, not Croft himself. She told them about the letter to the sheriff's office and about waiting 11 days for a response and about what Deputy Speck had told them when he came. She told them about Thursday night. She told it plainly, without making herself larger in it than she had been. She described standing on the roof in the rain and calling out Boone's name and what she'd said to him, and she described it in a tone that made clear it had not been a moment of easy courage. It had been a calculation, and the calculation had been that the alternative was worse. This ranch is my home, she said. I didn't come here knowing it would be. I came here because Gideon Voss asked me to be his partner, and I thought it was an offer worth taking. She looked at the room. I don't know what most of you thought about that when it happened. I know what some of you thought. I'm not asking anyone to revise their opinion of me tonight. She paused. What I'm asking is that when you form opinions about things going forward, you form them based on what's true, because the other kind cost all of us. She went back to stand beside Gideon. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a man in the third row, a rancher named Avery Polk, who she had seen in town but never spoken to, said, What do we do about the water rights situation? The one Boone was mapping. She had not expected the conversation to move directly to the practical. And then she thought, of course. These were people with land and livestock and problems that needed solving. The most useful thing she could give them was usefulness. She answered the question, and the next one, and the one after that. Afterward in the evening, she and Gideon walked back to the ranch the long way, because the evening was mild and neither of them was in a hurry. The summer dark came late in the valley, and there was still enough light to see the hills by, and the road was dry for the first time in weeks. They walked without talking for a while, which was something they had gotten comfortable with over these months, the specific comfort of silence that didn't require filling. You didn't tell me you were going to say that, Gideon said, about why you came here. I didn't know I was going to say it until I said it, she said. He was quiet for a moment, the part about it being worth taking. She looked at the road, at the hills going dark against the still pale sky. It's true, she said. He didn't say anything to that immediately. They walked a little further, then he said, I want to tell you something. All right. When I chose you, he said, and she noticed he said it that directly, not the arrangement or the marriage or the situation, but you. And she noticed it without looking at him. I told you I needed someone practical, someone who could handle pressure. And that was true. He paused. What I didn't tell you was that I'd been watching you for 2 years specifically because of the way you handled being alone and treated badly. Most people, that does something to them, shrinks them down. You just kept working, kept being exactly as good at your work as you were. I thought that was, he paused again, reaching for the right word, remarkable. She thought about that for a moment, about the 4 years in the cabin, about the bent nail and the hinge and the nights of lamplight and the slow accumulation of coin in the tin box, about what it had actually felt like from the inside, which was not remarkable. It had felt like surviving, which was what you did because it was the option available. I didn't feel remarkable, she said. I know, he said. That was the thing. She looked at him now. He was looking at the road ahead, his face in the failing light showing the lines of a man who had said something true and was not trying to take it back or qualify it or surround it with caveats. She thought about what she'd said at the meeting, about the offer worth taking. Gideon, she said. Yeah. I think you should know that the arrangement has changed, she said, from what it was at the start. For me. She said it plainly because plain was how she did things, and also because anything less plain would have felt false, and she did not have the patience for false at this stage of her life. He stopped walking. She stopped too because they were side by side and there wasn't a natural way to keep going. She looked at him in the last light. I know, he said. He said it quietly, and there was something in it that was not surprise, which meant he had been carrying it too, knowing it and not saying it, waiting for the right time in the way that people waited when they'd already been burned once by rushing something that needed to be taken at its own pace. She thought about what he'd said months ago, in her workshop, that he thought he'd used up what he had in that department. She thought about how he'd looked saying it, and how much of it she now understood had been a man protecting himself against an outcome he hadn't yet decided to believe in. I'm not asking you to, she started. Elena, he said. She stopped. I was wrong, he said, about what I thought I had left. He looked at her steadily. I've known that for a while. I didn't know how to say it. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the lamp burning between them that first winter night in the kitchen, about the roof in the rain and his face at the base of the barn looking up at her, about coffee at a kitchen table in the small hours and the silence that hadn't needed filling. You just said it, she said. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and they stood on the road in the last of the light, with the hills going dark around them and the ranch somewhere ahead in the dusk, solid and intact. They walked back to it together. Behind them, Black Ash Crossing settled into its evening sounds. The ordinary sounds of a small town going about the end of its day, unremarkable and persistent, which was exactly what she had wanted for it, and for herself. The plain, unglamorous, sustaining fact of ordinary life, held together. The summer that followed was the kind that people in Black Ash Crossing would talk about for years afterward, though not for any single dramatic reason. It was not a summer of great events. It was a summer of small things accumulating into something that changed the shape of the place, gradually, unevenly, in the way that real change moved when it wasn't being performed for an audience. Deputy Speck returned to the ranch one final time in late July to inform them that Aldrich Boone had been formally charged in connection with the Terrace Mountain Properties fraud. Not only the Callow Creek transaction, but 2 others that the investigation had uncovered once they had the company name and the paper trail to follow. The charges were serious enough that bail had been set high enough to hold. He would not be renting a room at the Crestfall Inn or anywhere else for a considerable while. Elena received this news with the same quiet she'd received most of the significant news of that year, not with display, just with the particular settling that came from a thing resolved. She thanked Speck. She offered him coffee, which he accepted. They sat at the kitchen table, and she asked him about the other ranchers, the ones from the other cases. and whether the resolution of Boone's prosecution would do anything for them, and Speck was honest with her about the limits of what the law could undo once property had changed hands legally, even under fraudulent pressure. Gerald Pruitt in Callow Creek would not get his ranch back. She sat with that after Speck left. It was the part that didn't resolve neatly, and she had known it wouldn't, and she had decided sometime in those long, watchful nights that the inability to fix everything was not a reason to fix nothing, but she still sat with it. She thought it was important to sit with the things that didn't resolve rather than burying them under the things that did. The workshop opened in September. It had been her idea from the beginning. She had been turning it over since the spring, and what had taken time was not the decision, but the specifics, which were the part that actually determined whether something worked or didn't. She had spent the summer asking quiet questions and listening carefully, the way she did most things, mapping which skills were most needed and which people were most likely to use a space like this if it existed. She had also, with some difficulty, decided where to put it. Not in the old cabin. That was too small and too far from the center of things. She proposed to Gideon that they build a proper structure on the edge of the ranch's eastern boundary, at the point where the ranch property met the road that most people used coming in and out of the valley. He had looked at the location and looked at the building she was describing. Simple, functional, large enough for 6 or 8 people to work in at once, and said yes without requiring her to justify it at length, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him. The building went up in August, put together by the ranch hands during the lull between the hay cutting and the fall roundup, with some additional labor from 3 families in the valley who contributed it in exchange for early access to whatever the workshop produced. It was not a pretty building. It was square and solid, and the windows were slightly uneven because Tommy Reeves had cut the frames and Tommy was still learning, and she had decided that the slightly uneven windows were fine because the building was not a statement about beauty, it was a statement about use. She put a sign above the door. She had carved it herself from a piece of wood she'd planed smooth, and the lettering was not professional, but it was legible. It said, Mercer Workshop. She had kept her name, had always kept it professionally, even after the marriage, which had been one of her conditions and which Gideon had not questioned. The name on the sign was not stubbornness, it was clarity. The workshop was hers in the specific way that things were yours when you built them from intention rather than inheritance. The first week, 4 people came. A widow named Ruth Standish, whose husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with a homestead and no income and 2 children she was trying to hold together on dried beans and determination. A young man named Price, who had arrived in the valley with no particular skills and a vague hope of finding ranch work, and had found instead that ranch work required things he didn't know how to do yet. A girl of about 15 whose parents had sent her with the tone of people doing something they weren't sure about, and who turned out to be the quickest study Elena had encountered in years. And unexpectedly, which Elena filed as important information about how people actually worked versus how they said they would. A man in his 50s named Garrett, who had been ranching for 30 years and who came in on the second day and stood in the doorway and said he'd heard she knew something about leather work that the saddler in town didn't. She told him to sit down and showed him what she meant. By the 3rd week, there were 11 people coming with some regularity. The girl, whose name was June, had already surpassed what Elena had taught her in the first week and was experimenting on her own, which Elena recognized as the signal that meant she needed harder problems, not more basics. Ruth Standish had taken to the winter garment work with the focus of a woman who understood exactly why it mattered. She had children to keep warm and not enough coin to buy what she needed, and here was a way to make what she needed, and she came every day, and she stayed late, and she never needed to be told anything twice. Elena taught them what she knew, which was a great deal. She also, more importantly, taught them how to figure out what they didn't know yet, which materials would hold and which would fail, how to read a problem before you tried to solve it, how to adjust when the first approach didn't work. This was the skill underneath the skill, the one that most people who taught things forgot to teach, and she had learned it not from anyone's instruction, but from years of sitting alone with a problem and no one to ask and figuring it out anyway. What? Marta Hesse came by one afternoon in October, ostensibly to pick up a pattern she'd asked Elena to design, and stayed for an hour watching the workshop operate. She sat in the corner with her coffee and observed the particular organized energy of people learning things they needed to know. And at the end of the hour, she said, "You're good at this." "At teaching?" "At making people feel like they can," Marta said. She considered the room. "That's not the same as teaching. Some teachers make you feel smaller by comparison. You make people feel like the gap between what they know and what they need to know is closable." Elena thought about the girl June, working on a problem with a strip of harness leather at the far table, her face entirely concentrated. She thought about Ruth Standish, who had come in that morning with a winter coat she'd finished the previous night, holding it up without saying anything, waiting for assessment, and whose face, when Elena had gone through it seam by seam and found only one small issue in the collar, had been the face of someone adding a piece to a picture of themselves that they hadn't been sure would hold together. "It's closable," Elena said. "The gap. That's the truth of it. Most people aren't far from capable. They're just far from being shown that they're capable." Marta looked at her. "You figured that out about yourself a long time ago." "I figured it out slowly," Elena said, "and I got lucky in a few places. I didn't have anybody making it harder than it needed to be. Or when they did, I was stubborn enough to not let it stick." "That's not luck," Marta said. "That's character." Elena didn't argue the point, but she thought about it afterward, when the workshop had emptied for the evening and she was closing up. She thought about luck and character and how hard it was sometimes to know which was which, whether the stubbornness was something she'd been born with or something she'd built in response to circumstance. She had come to think it didn't matter as much as people assumed. What you were and what you became under pressure were not two separate things. They were the same thing, looked at from different angles. Carol Pemberton came to the workshop in November. Elena saw her from across the room when she came through the door, and her first honest response was wariness, followed immediately by a decision to set the wariness aside and see what actually happened before responding to it. This was harder than it sounded. Carol stood inside the doorway for a moment, looking at the room with the expression of a woman who had prepared something to say and was now finding that the room itself was not what she'd expected, which was disrupting the preparation. She had dressed carefully, Elena noticed, which was Carol's particular way of armoring herself for situations she wasn't sure about. The room was occupied. Garrett was at the leather bench. Two of the Valley women were working on winter gear at the long table. June was in the corner doing something with a needle and a piece of canvas that she'd declared was going to be a bag of a specific design, and she was probably right. Carol looked at Elena. Elena set down what she was doing and walked over. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said. "Mrs. Voss," Carol said. The name sat differently in her mouth than it had a year ago. Not warmly. Elena was not going to pretend there was warmth, but without the particular cutting quality it had carried before. "I wanted to see what this was." "Come in properly then," Elena said. "I'll show you." She walked Carol through the space the way she walked anyone through it, showing what was being worked on, explaining the purpose of each area, not making it into a demonstration of herself, but into a demonstration of the place, which was different. Carol asked 2 questions. They were specific questions, not performance. One about where the materials came from, and one about how people were paying for their time here. The second question told Elena something, because it was the question of a person who understood the practical dimension of things. "They pay what they can when they can," Elena said. "Some pay in labor. 2 of the families did work on the building when it went up. Some pay in goods. Some don't pay at all yet. Ruth Standish, over there, hasn't paid anything yet, and I don't expect her to until her situation improves." She paused. "The ranch covers the difference for now. When the workshop starts producing more finished goods we can sell through the Merton market, it'll cover more of its own costs." Carol looked at Ruth Standish, who was working with focused concentration and had not looked up. "She lost her husband last winter," Carol said. "Yes," Elena said. A silence. Then Carol said, "I have a set of curtains that need to be relined. The lining's gone fragile from the sun." Elena looked at her. "I can do that," she said. "Bring them by." Carol nodded. She looked around the room one more time with the expression of someone updating a calculation they'd been running for a while. Then she said, not meeting Elena's eyes directly, "I didn't know what Boone was going to do to the property." "I know," Elena said. Carol looked at her now. You said that before, at the meeting. I meant it both times, Elena said. Another silence. It was not a comfortable silence, and Elena didn't try to make it one. Some silences needed to be what they were. Well, Carol said. Well, Elena agreed. Carol left. She came back the following week with the curtains, and Elena relined them, and they were returned without incident. It was not a friendship. It was not even a reconciliation exactly. It was closer to two people deciding that the war between them was costing more than it was producing and setting it down without ceremony. Elena found she could live with that. She had not needed Carol Pemberton's approval at the start, and she did not need it now. What she had needed was for the opposition to become neutral, and neutral was what she had. The year turned. Winter arrived more gently than the previous one, which everyone in the valley acknowledged with the cautious relief of people who had learned not to trust easy winters all the way to the end. The workshop continued through the cold months without interruption, which was partly because Elena had planned for the cold. The fireplace drew well, and she had laid in enough wood, and partly because the people who came had their own reasons to keep coming that had nothing to do with convenience. June, the 15-year-old, had by December produced 3 pieces of work that Elena would not have been ashamed to have made herself, and she told her so directly, which made the girl go very still for a moment in the way that people went still when they received something they hadn't fully believed was coming. Elena thought about that stillness for days afterward. She thought about how many people walked around carrying the weight of not being told plainly that they were good at what they were doing, and how little it cost to tell them, and how much it gave back. Ruth Standish had by January taken in her first outside commissions. 2 families in the valley who had heard about her work through the Merton market connection Elena had helped her establish. She came to Elena one Thursday morning with payment in hand, the first real payment she'd received for her own skilled work, and she set it on the work table and looked at it, and then looked at Elena and said, "I didn't think I was going to be all right." "I know," Elena said. "Are you going to tell me I was wrong to think that?" Elena looked at her honestly. "No," she said. "You were in a very hard position, and it wasn't obvious it was going to get better. What I'll tell you is that you did the work anyway. That's not the same as me telling you it was always going to be fine." Ruth picked up the money and put it back in her pocket and stood a little differently than she'd stood when she came in. "That's a better thing to say," she said. "I know," Elena said. "Sit down. I'll get coffee." Frank O'Dara got married in February to a woman from the Merton Valley who had come to the area in November with her brother's family, and who had, by the account of everyone who knew her, decided Frank was what she wanted with a directness that had apparently left Frank somewhat overwhelmed and eventually persuaded. The wedding was small and practical in the county clerk's office, which made Elena privately feel something she recognized as kinship. She made the dress. She had not been asked. Frank had mentioned the wedding in passing, at the barn, not looking at her, in the way he did things that mattered without quite addressing the matter directly, and she had said, "Tell her to come see me," and left it at that. The woman's name was Clara, and she came to the workshop 2 weeks before the wedding with the expression of someone who has been told something might be possible but isn't entirely certain, and Elena showed her 3 fabrics and let her choose, and made the dress in 6 evenings' work. It was not an extravagant dress. Clara was not an extravagant woman, which was probably why she and Frank suited each other. It was a good dress. The kind of dress that fit properly and moved right and would last, which was a better thing than a dress that looked remarkable for one day and fell apart after. When Frank saw it, he looked at Elena with the expression he'd developed over this past year, which was the expression of a man who had updated his opinion of someone entirely and was still sometimes catching up to how far the update had gone. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Gideon found her in the workshop on a Tuesday evening in March, a full year after the first winter had broken. She was the last one there. Everyone else had gone, and she was banking the fire and putting the tools away, which she did at the end of every session, and she had not heard him come in. She looked up, and he was standing in the doorway, which was where people stood in this workshop when they first arrived, and she had a sudden clear sense of the year, all of it, From the morning she'd been on her knees with the hinge and the bent nail, through every piece of it, to this particular doorway in this particular evening light. "Long day," he said. "Good long day," she said. It was a distinction she had come to make, because she had had both kinds and they were not the same. He came in and sat on the bench near the cold fire and watched her finish putting things away. She was conscious of him watching and also comfortable with it, which was itself a thing she had taken time to grow into. Being seen without feeling that being seen was a precursor to being found wanting. "The Halverson boy came to see me today," Gideon said. "The younger one. He wants to know if the workshop takes on apprentices full time. He wants to learn leather work." She set the last tool on its hook and turned around. "How old is he?" 16, 17, come spring." She thought about it. The workshop had grown to the point where it was beginning to produce more than its current setup could handle efficiently. A dedicated apprentice was not a bad problem to have. It was the kind of problem that came from a thing working. "Tell him to come talk to me," she said. Gideon nodded. He looked around the workshop, the organized tools, the work surfaces, the two pieces that Ruth Standish had left drying overnight, the canvas bag that June had finished and left hanging on the wall peg in the corner because she'd said it looked better there and wanted Elena's opinion of it in the morning. The uneven windows, letting in the last thin light of the evening. "You built something here," he said. "We built something here," she said. He looked at her. "Don't do that," she said, almost smiling. "Don't give it back to me like it doesn't belong to both of us. You put up the building, you covered the costs for 6 months without asking when I'd pay it back. You told the crew to help when they could." She paused. "You trusted me when you had no particular reason to yet. That's not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not easy to give credit to," he said. "I'm not easy to do a lot of things to," she said. "No," he agreed, and the way he said it was not a complaint. She came and sat beside him on the bench near the banked fire. The workshop was quiet around them, the specific quiet of a place that has had people in it all day and is resting. Outside, the March wind moved through the cottonwoods the way it always did, telling her about the weather and the temperature and the time of night, the language she had been learning since the first winter she'd spent in this valley. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, on her knees in the dirt with a bent nail and a rock, trying to fix a hinge on a door that barely kept the cold out. She thought about Carol Pemberton on the porch, about Marta holding a bread loaf and saying, "This is going to be harder than you know yet," about the night on the barn roof in the rain, the lamp oil canister on the ground, Boone's face when his arithmetic came out wrong. She thought about what she believed, underneath all of it, that the year had confirmed and that she had suspected since long before it, that the only real currency in any place was competence brought honestly to bear on what needed doing. Not social position, not beauty or wealth or the right name or who wanted to marry you or who didn't. Just the work, done well, again and again, until the evidence accumulated into something nobody could reasonably argue with. She was aware this was not a complete philosophy. She was aware that she had been lucky in specific ways, that Gideon had been who he was, that Marta had been who she was, that Cal Brigham had been the kind of man who updated his opinions when the evidence changed. She was aware that other women in other situations had done everything right and been defeated anyway, and that the world did not reliably reward what it should reward. She did not pretend otherwise to herself. But she also believed that you acted from what you could control, not from what you couldn't. You brought the competence. You did the work. You stayed when it would have been easier to leave, not out of stubbornness for its own sake, but out of the specific knowledge that leaving would mean the people who wanted you gone had set the terms. You let the evidence speak in the only language it was allowed to speak, which was the language of time and accumulated fact. And you found, sometimes, that it was enough. Not perfectly enough. Not triumphantly enough. Just enough. Which was, she had concluded, what enough actually felt like from the inside when you were living it rather than waiting for it to look the way you'd imagined it would. She sat in the quiet workshop with Gideon beside her and the tools on their hooks and the half-finished work on the benches and the uneven windows going dark, and she felt something she did not try to name too precisely because she had learned that some things lost something in the naming. What she knew was, she was here. The ranch was here. The workshop was here. The people who had come through the door and learned something and left with more than they'd arrived with were here, scattered through the valley in their various homesteads and their various lives, carrying what they'd built. And she had been part of that. Not because someone had given her permission, not because the town had decided to approve of her, not because everything had worked out the way it was supposed to, but because she had stayed at the work, day after day, in the plain and unglamorous way that most things that lasted were actually built. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and she listened to it, and she knew what it was saying, and she was satisfied.